At the start of the war, Bletchley Park, a mansion house 50 miles north of London, had become Station X, the most secret place in Britain. The best and the brightest had been recruited to try to read the Germans' secret messages. The German code machine, the Enigma, was the most ingenious the world had ever seen. The Germans believed it could never be broken. But as Britain was about to enter the darkest days of war, Station X was beginning to unravel the secret of the mighty Enigma.
It seems rather hard when spring is caressing the land and when, after the rigors of winter, our fields and woodlands are reviving, that all our thoughts must be turned and bent upon sterner war. I cannot assure you that the war will be short, and still less that it will be easy.
Bletchley Park was, in a sense, remote from the war, while all round us the most terrible things were going on. And I think that worried some of the young men there. They were extremely worried that their contemporaries were flying over Berlin, were being burnt alive, being shot down, prisoners of war. But there was no help really thinking of those things. We got on with life as we could.
Until 1940, Britain had suffered little in the so-called phony war. The Blitz, the constant bombardment of British cities, changed everything.
Well, there was one very good remark, is the only good German is a dead one. We felt very, very strongly. Well, they'd bombed us. They'd, every day, every night, with Heinkels and Dorniers. They'd killed a lot of people in London and in the cities. You couldn't have any pity for the Germans under those circumstances.
What a triumph the life of these battered cities is over the worst that fire and bomb can do.
In these, the grimmest days of war, Station X was Churchill's one glimmer of hope. Access to the enemy's innermost secrets could make the difference between victory and defeat. The codebreakers were working around the clock to break the Enigma. Station X had divided into huts to attack different parts of the German war machine. Hut 6 was concentrating on the Air Force Enigma. Ironically, it was the technologically advanced Luftwaffe that was the most vulnerable. The German Air Force had a high regard for itself as the new elite, but they were hopeless at security. They were ripe for breaking. For months, Station X had been listening in to the secret messages from German airfields to their headquarters in Berlin, but without being able to understand a word of them. Now they must find a way, and quickly. Hitler was preparing to invade Britain.
It was like looking for something in a dark room. One didn't really know what one was looking for. And I thought, but I had great confidence. I felt, I'm going to find some way to break back into the red. I began to think about a German operator. What would he do? at the beginning of his day. Possibly he was a lazy fellow, or if he was in a very dangerous situation, he might just, you know, have the wind up.
The odds stacked against the code breakers of cracking the Enigma code were 150 million to 1. When the operator pressed the real letter on the machine, a coded letter would light up. The brilliance of the Enigma was that by sending the letter through a series of rotors, the coded letter that emerged would be different every time. But for the system to work, the Enigma sending the message and the one receiving it must be set up in exactly the same way. First, secret instructions from base told the operators which of the different rotors to use and in what order. Next, the Ringstellung, a ring of letters around the edge of each rotor, was adjusted to that day's setting. But John Herreville discovered that the operators were then making a fatal mistake. It became known as the Herreville tip.
What the operator should do, of course, is when they've done a setting on a cipher machine, you should always spin the wheels so that it randomizes the position. But the hold of the Herreville tip depended on the German operator either being under pressure or lazy and not doing that.
The operator would have to send the 3 random letters by Morse to the person at the other end so that both machines would be set to the same start position. But Herreville realized that if the operator had failed to spin his rotors as he should, then the 3 letters he was sending over the airwaves, uncoded, would be the secret Ringstellung. Instructions were quickly sent out to the Y stations where the German messages were intercepted to pay particular attention to the first of each day's messages. That's when the mistake would show up, if it was going to show up at all. Hut 6 studied the opening letter groups of the intercepts as fast as they arrived to see if the Herreville tip had worked. Sometimes the operator had made only a half-hearted attempt to spin the rotors, so LWZ had become LYB, just a click or two away, or perhaps LUX. But as more and more letter groups were plotted, the codebreakers began to see clusters of letters that revealed the original secret setting. Herreville's tip was working. Not one operator, but many had all made similar mistakes. At last, Luftwaffe Red was broken. The codebreakers could now give the RAF vital details of how the Luftwaffe was organized and what it was planning. Even if they didn't always know exactly where or when.
You don't get a message saying, we are going to do the following great things in the next 6 months of the year, signed Hitler. There's nothing like that at all. You don't get anything on a plate. There's a case of an intercept which consisted entirely of figures, random figures. Someone says, I wonder if they are coordinates on a map, and they all turn out to be airfields. You did, in fact, get from that they were readying and building up airfields because they were going to concentrate their forces on attacking Britain.
Hut 6 broke the Air Force Enigma every day till the end of the war, and soon they discovered other mistakes that the operators were making. Every Morse code message could be intercepted by the enemy. So the Germans had to find a way of transmitting the settings for each message that only the Enigma operator would be able to figure out. They thought they had found the perfect solution. Use the Enigma itself to disguise the setting. The operator had already been told to think up 3 random letters for the initial rotor setting. Now he was told to think up 3 more and type them into the Enigma. They would be the key for that particular message, and since they were being encoded, they could be transmitted in complete safety.
On the surface, it looks like a foolproof indicator system. The true setting of the message is hidden. However, the weakness was leaving the selection of the 3 letters to the operator at random. And human beings simply are not random.
Hut 6 soon saw connections between the 2 sets of supposedly random letters. Once they had got the first 3 letters, which were sent in plain text, they could often guess the second 3, which were in code. One operator called Walter became legendary at Station X. Every day he would set his rotors to the first 3 letters of his name, and then type in the first 3 letters of his girlfriend's name, Clara. The code breakers loved them.
One wonderful one, the outside indicator was Tom. And we thought, oh, Tom. And we thought that didn't work. It was Tom Mix. The American cowboy actor from the 1920s. I didn't know in Germany anybody knew who Tom Mix was. But apparently he had a following in Germany.
HIT was almost invariably followed by LER. Even Hitler was helping to break the enigma.
They were given the manuals, they were told exactly what to do and how to use the machine. But part of the problem was this myth that the Enigma machine was completely unbreakable. And this was buried deep in the German psyche. So therefore they thought, well, why bother? You know, nobody can break these messages if we use these keys because they're easy.
If you saw LON was the first thing, it was almost certain that DON was the second. MAD was RID. BER was LIN.
In the heat of battle, you put up dirty words, and I am the world expert on dirty German words. The worst message I ever had come near me was one from the German High Command to someone in the German intelligence, reprimanding them for using these words because did they not know that young girls were having to decode them? And of course the young girl at Bletchley was devastated because they went on doing it, I might say, never mind the reprimand. But it was nice to think the Germans had that side of them, that they did think that perhaps they oughtn't to use dirty words in their encodements.
As more and more codes were broken, more and more people were needed. In the 1940s, Bletchley was an unprepossessing Midland Railway junction, halfway between Oxford and Cambridge.
Full of steam trains with a steamer and loads of ammunition and that. And if I came off the late shift and Mr. Tomlins was waiting on his engine and he saw me booming across here, he'd go, doo, doo, you know. Yes, it was all steam.
These women were not code breakers. They kept Station X running. They were recruited from the forces and ministries to handle the growing piles of paperwork.
You remember the frogs that used to come out and get run over by the bus?
No, I don't remember this lovely
The frogs
lake.
used to come out at spawning time, and then when those buses went round, they used to go over them, crunch, crunch, crunch. Oh, it was horrible.
And the frogs were mating all the way up there. And you trod on them. It was disgusting.
You read the Morse. It was called, this was Morse slip reading. Yeah. You had a Morse slip, you see,
Right,
and it
yeah.
got pulled along in front of you.
Yeah. No, I mean, I know we grumble about the climate and everything, don't we?
There were some exceptions, but with few exceptions, they were doing the donkey work. They were setting up machines, typing, filing, keeping records and things like that. I think some of the girls must have had a terrible, terrible time and not really understanding what they were doing.
They couldn't do without the typists because it's surprising. They couldn't spell, you know, these people from Eton. The spelling was atrocious. They talk about education today, but it was atrocious.
We were the workers. There were lots and lots and lots of super brains, but girls like us, we were the workhorses. But I suppose if all these people if we hadn't worked hard, all their efforts would have been in vain. Look at those geese.
Yes. Yeah,
they're the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of the ones that used to be
nice.
here during the war. Nasty, vicious things.
Most of us who were among the, what shall I say, the hoi polloi, the lower grades, never knew what went on at Bletchley Park. The only time I realised what we were actually doing was when I was shown a code book which had just been captured and rushed to Bletchley from a captured plane. And of course we had no plastic envelopes or anything then. The poor thing was just given to me as it was, and I was horrified to see a huge blood stain on it. The blood round the edges was drying, but the blood in the middle was still wet, and I realised then that somewhere was this German air crew bleeding, still bleeding, while I was decoding. I was writing out in modern German their new code book, and that did bring the war very close.
By 1941, Britain was losing the war. Despite Station X's success with the Luftwaffe, they had got nowhere with the enigma of the German Navy. And it was the Navy that was now the problem. German U-boats were wreaking havoc in the Battle of the Atlantic. Every merchant ship that was sunk deprived Britain of the urgent supplies it needed to survive. Hitler had entrusted Admiral Karl Dönitz with the task of destroying Britain's lifeline.
It was Dönitz who realized quite early on that he could defeat the Allies by bringing England to its knees by starving us. If he could break that North Atlantic route, then there could be no food, fuel, troops, munitions come to this country. And he could win that war by U-boats. And he nearly succeeded.
Dönitz tried to build up a kind of elite spirit, and everybody was proud to take part in that. And we were very eager to join that force. And of course we had been brought up to adore taking risks in the National Socialist period when we were boys. So we were not really aware of the risk.
Dönitz built giant fortified U-boat pens on the French coast. From here, his U-boats could strike out into the Atlantic. The Germans knew that the British were protecting their ships by convoys. To get round this, Dönitz organized his U-boats into groups, wolf packs. As the slow-moving convoys crossed the Atlantic, wolf packs of 30 boats or more would lie in wait.
Almost every convoy, there would be losses. They were very crafty, these German U-boat commanders. They would anticipate our route and oft submerge in daylight just ahead of the convoy and let the convoy pass over them and torpedo right, left and center, and we wouldn't know where the attack had come from.
The wolf packs were controlled by Dönitz by radio messages encoded on the Enigma. Breaking the naval Enigma was to be Station X's biggest challenge. If they failed, the Battle of the Atlantic and the war could be lost. Alan Turing was the right man in the right place at the right time.
Alan Turing was unique. I mean, he was a genius, and what you realize when you get to know a genius well is that there's all the difference between a very intelligent person and a genius. They're with very intelligent people. You talk to them, they come out with an idea, and you say to yourself, if not to them, you know, I could have had that idea. You never had this feeling with Turing at all. He constantly surprised you with the originality of his thinking. It was marvelous.
Alan Turing was the most brilliant mind of his generation. He had become a Cambridge professor at only 23. His work on intelligent machines was years ahead of his time. Station X suited both his genius and his eccentricity.
He had funny manners, he didn't like wearing a tie, he always looked untidy, but he quite liked being out in the country where he cycled around. He cycled with a gas mask on during hay fever period. He didn't care what he looked like, he just thought that doing a job was what mattered.
He was very shy of women, particularly girls. I don't think he'd ever met any girls before. I did once offer him a cup of tea, and he shrank back as if he was going to be shot. And he used to, bless his heart, walk down to the canteen in a curious sideways motion, with his head down. But he was such a star. We all thought he was the most wonderful thing.
Alan Turing set himself the challenge of breaking into the naval enigma. In an attic room at Bletchley Park, Turing began to unravel the secrets of the U-boat messages. All he had to go on were the scrambled letters. Incredibly, as he studied them, Turing was able to discover exactly how the Germans were hiding the key message setting. Unlike the Luftwaffe, the German Navy was leaving nothing to chance. Instead of letting the operator choose 3 letters at random for his message setting, he had to get it from a book. With practically no information to go on, Turing identified how the Navy operators selected their keys from a list for each day. He rightly guessed that to hide the key, these letters were encoded using secret tables, and that instead of substituting one letter by another letter, these bigram tables substituted pairs of letters. Turing worked all this out and got it absolutely right.
These codes were printed on rose paper in a ink that would immediately fade out if it got wet. So our orders were, in case of any difficulty, immediately to throw this material overboard or at least soak it in water so it could not be read.
Turing had made the first important breakthrough, but he knew that to crack the naval enigma, they would first have to get hold of those secret bigram tables. Then came an amazing stroke of luck. Captain Fritz Julius Lemp was a hero of the Third Reich. His U-boat, the U-110, had sunk the first ship in the war. In May 1941, he set out on what was to be his last mission. David Baum had just turned 20. He was a sub-lieutenant on HMS Bulldog, on escort duty guarding the 50 ships in convoy OB-318 from Liverpool, bound for America.
We were south of Iceland, and we knew we were being shadowed. You get reports back from the Admiralty, they were being shadowed by U-boats, and we always knew we'd be attacked in this area. Suddenly, 2 ships were torpedoed, one after another. It was obvious where the attack had come from, and the corvette Obrisha made a very accurate attack on the U-boat. Must have got the depth charges just for the right depth.
Georg Hugel was an Enigma operator on U-110. He had been with Captain Lemp throughout the war.
Es fiel sofort das Licht aus
Das ist ja kein gutes Gefühl, wenn man im Dunkeln sitzt und nachher lediglich die Notbeleuchtung da aufleuchtet. Dann hat man natürlich Mühe und Not, da die Sicherungen wieder reinzubringen und zu überlegen, ja, kommt irgendwo Wasser.
It was a classic attack. Depth charges underneath the U-boat, blew it to the surface. It was a dream of every escort vessel to see a U-boat blown to the surface, because usually they just sink when you do have a successful attack and go down to the bottom.
This was just the chance that Turing and Station X had been waiting for. On board the U-110 were the secret bigram tables.
Wir unten im Boot hatten keine Ahnung davon, wie es da oben aussah, aber der Kommandant oben auf der Brücke, der rief dann ständig raus, raus, raus. Wir haben gefragt, was soll geschehen mit den Geheimsachen. Und bekamen wir eben die Order, alles liegen zu lassen und nur danach zu trachten, rauszukommen. Ich weiß nicht, daran kann ja wohl keine Kritik geübt werden. Kein Mensch kann sich die Situation vorstellen, der nicht selbst dabei war.
The Germans abandoned ship, leaving the codebooks behind. But Georg Hubel had one precious document he had to rescue, a book of love poems to his girlfriend.
Wieder zurück, habe dann noch einen kleinen Schrank aufgesperrt, wo die Schlüssel drin waren, holte den Schlüssel raus für den Betreffenden, wo also die Bücher und auch meines war. Holte das Büchlein raus, wollte es in die Tasche stecken, das ging nicht, weil es doch für die Tasche zu groß war. Und dann habe ich also mein Hemd aufgeknöpft und habe es vorne reingeschmissen. Das lag mir dann also an der Brust. Und so bin ich dann nachher auch so ungefähr eine halbe Stunde geschwommen.
David Baum led a boarding party across to the stricken submarine. But what if the Germans had left an armed man behind to scuttle the boat? Baum went aboard first.
One couldn't imagine the Germans would have abandoned this U-boat floating in the Atlantic without someone down below trying to sink her. But at any rate, I got my revolver out. Secondary lighting, a dim blue lighting, was on, and I couldn't see anybody. Just a nasty hissing noise, which I didn't like the sound of. To this day, I don't know what it was.
The rest of the boarding party began to search the U-boat. They had no idea what they were looking for. They did not know about the secret bigram tables. David Baum had never heard of Station X.
I sat down at the captain's desk in his cabin, and suddenly, amongst all the things, I think his Iron Cross was there, and I put that into a bag, and there's odds and ends. But also I came across a sealed envelope. I didn't open it. I wouldn't have understood it anyway, not speaking German. But it obviously was something fairly important, being a sealed envelope in his desk. So I popped it into my pocket.
At the time, David Baum had no idea of the importance of what he and his boarding crew had found. The capture of U-110 was a disaster for the Germans and a treasure trove for Station X. The codebreakers now had the secret tables of the naval enigma. Captain Lemp died in the attack. No one will ever know why he did not scuttle the U-boat or why he did not destroy the codes.
One of the survivors was alongside Lemp in the water, waiting to be picked up by the corvette, and he turned away to look at something, and then when he turned back, Lemp wasn't there, so he might have realized the U-boat was being boarded and committed suicide. I don't know.
Das kann man jetzt im Nachhinein nicht mehr. Ich musste mich ja darauf verlassen, wie die Befehle waren. Ne? Nachdem der Befehl eindeutig war, das drin zu lassen und nach oben zu steigen oder zu klettern, da gab es keinen anderen Weg.
The only document on the U-110 that did not end up in British hands was the book of love poems to aid it. If Georg Hugel had rescued the bigram tables instead, things may have been very different. When the captured documents reached Station X, the code breakers were ecstatic. Now they could begin to break the naval enigma. King George VI called this the most important event of the war at sea so far.
The prize were the bigram tables, and they were magnificent. Although some of them had got a bit wet and we had to dry them. Geoffrey Tandy, having been at the Natural History Museum, had access to proper drying paper, which he brought down by a load, and we had to dry those, and clean them up, and distribute them as necessary.
Almost immediately, the results were evident. On June the 23rd, 1941, Station X decoded a U-boat message that would save a convoy. HX-133 was heading for England, laden with supplies. The codebreakers revealed that a wolf pack of 10 U-boats was lying in wait. Armed with this knowledge, the Admiralty could set up a counterattack. The attack lasted 5 days. 2 of the U-boats were sunk, and the convoy arrived safely. Station X had joined the Battle of the Atlantic.
All this code-breaking business was like a relay race, and so in the spring of 1941 it became possible to decipher the naval messages within usually without a week or so's delay. It was still very difficult because it was still a more complex system than the others, but throughout 1941 at last the naval system began to roll off on the production line in a way that was being employed for the other services.
Within a month, convoy sinkings dropped by 1/3. With the information from Station X, along with the advances in radar detection, Western Approaches, a giant operations base concreted under the streets of Liverpool, was able to reroute the convoys around the wolf packs and to foil Dönitz's plans. In 1 month, Station X decodes made it possible to sink 7 out of 8 U-boat supply ships.
They could start to read the German signals like a German radio operator because they had the cipher settings in the machine. Admiral Dönitz had the first fear that there is some problem with the security of the ciphers when in June 1941 all the German supply ships, the tankers, were intercepted by the British and sunk in a few weeks. This could only come from signal intelligence.
We had talks in our bases about many boats being approached under queer circumstances. But there were always talks about the girls in France leaking out things and that, or base personnel, or French workers at the workshops. But this was all.
One has the feelings that people didn't like to see the truth. And among the high-ranking people, I think there was no awareness of the danger. In fact, several investigations that took place in the Navy always ended with excuses, like it can be explained in this way, it can be explained in that way. They looked for excuses instead of looking for the real reason for the losses.
And German confidence was about to be strengthened even more.
I think the fact that there were so many women and so few men did make Bletchley a unique place at the time. Everybody who was there was in an atmosphere which made for that sort of romance. Sometimes I did feel that I was extraordinarily lucky to be in the situation that I was in Bletchley, where there were so many interesting girls around, as compared with if I'd been out fighting in North Africa. I felt I was very privileged in that sense.
It was a much preferable war than tramping through the desert or on the beaches of Normandy. We were safe. It was more dangerous going on leave through London, crossing London in a blitz than sitting here. So in a sense, it was an easy war.
It was a very exciting time.
It was interesting,
wasn't
yes.
it?
I think we were terribly lucky.
Well, we were lucky considering it was a war.
We were younger than a lot of the people there, and I suppose at that age you're a bit silly and you think, oh dear, how boring, all these old men. Well, all you're interested in, you like nice young men, you know, pilots.
Many of the women who came to Station X in those early war years were from privileged backgrounds.
We used to meet at Claridge's or the Ritz. I used to catch a bus at Sloane Square, sometimes waiting a long time for it, depending on if there was an air raid or not. And the conductor would say, "Where do you want to go, darling?" And I'd say, "Do you think you could possibly drop me at the Ritz? Would it be all right?" And he'd say, "Of course, it's on my route." And he would. We were lucky because we... And you didn't go to sleep that night, and you caught the milk train back to Bletchley at 5 o'clock in the morning, hoping that the boss didn't notice that you were a touch overdressed for work. So that was how we did it.
Bless 'em all, the long and the short and the tall.
I've always imagined that they were looking for people rather like us because we were fortunately fairly well off, and obviously on the whole knew what you would call very nice people, who would be above suspicion and wouldn't have rather dubious friends. I always imagined that's what it was.
So cheer up, my lads, bless 'em all.
There were a group of debutantes. We used to listen to them talking about Queen Charlotte's and about the beautiful nightclubs they'd been taken to, and we admired the pearls that they wore underneath their shirts because they were real and they had to be worn next to the skin in order to keep the luster.
You'll get no promotion this side of the ocean, so cheer up, my lads, bless 'em all.
Commander Saunders, who was a bit of a tyrant in Hut 3, decided he didn't want to have a canteen tea anymore in a plastic mug, and I'm not surprised. So Anne was told she'd got to make his tea, and I had a pathetic telephone call saying, "Valerie, how do I get the tea under the water?"
Bless 'em all, bless 'em all, the long and the short and the tall. Bless all the sergeants and
Then, America entered the war. To Churchill's great relief, after Pearl Harbor, Britain and America were at last official allies. Churchill had told President Roosevelt about Station X early in the war to encourage American help. Code breaking was a valuable bargaining chip. But as the third Christmas of the war approached, and more messages from Station X were being sent to Washington, the new relationship was about to face its first real test. American power was enormous, but in 1941, America was not prepared for war. Germany was 4,000 miles away. The US Navy didn't even employ a convoy system.
Among many naval officers, it was considered below their dignity to shepherd merchant ships. They had been trained to fight naval battles, deep water battles, crossing the T against battleships and cruisers. No naval officer worth his salt wanted to be tied down by the lame duty of escorting freighters and tankers.
Admiral Dönitz, however, was more than ready to take on America. A pack of U-boats was ordered to cross the Atlantic. Dönitz was audaciously planning to enter the Lion's Den and attack shipping right off America's shores.
Begann es für uns damit, dass wir am 23. Dezember 1941 ausliefen und gar nicht wussten, wohin. Nur der Kommandant wusste es. Und da war befohlen, dass wir auf gar keinen Fall irgendetwas funken durften, um nicht zu verraten, wo unser Boot steht.
But within days, Dönitz sent a signal that broke his own self-imposed radio silence. It was a message to one of the boats, the U-123. Dönitz had blown his cover. Within hours, the message was with the codebreakers at Station X. Dönitz had taken a calculated risk in sending the signal. As ever, the Germans were too confident in the Enigma.
They always refused to believe that their highest grade ciphers were breakable. They believed that they were the Übermenschen, they were the Supermen, and we were the Untermenschen, we were the submen. And the idea that we could possibly be actually proving cleverer than they were was unthinkable.
But the unthinkable was happening. Soon the decoded message was on its way to the submarine tracking room at the Admiralty.
Now this was the message directing them to their individual operational areas and specifying that January 13 was to be the date on which they were all to begin a simultaneous attack. The operation was to be called Operation Paukenschlag, or drumbeat, and that meant a single sharp attack by all the boats on that given day.
The U-boats were planning to attack America on its own doorstep, right in the middle of the shipping lanes, Cape Hatteras on the Carolina coast. The Admiralty immediately relayed the information on drumbeat to American naval intelligence. This was the fruit of the cooperation that Churchill had hoped for, but the warning was in vain. The U-boats now began a series of devastating attacks. Soon there was a trail of slaughter. Tankers, freighters, anything afloat, just as Station X had predicted.
All the boats moved down the coastline toward Cape Hatteras, sinking ships as they went, sinking them at will. The freighters and tankers were moving in single line with all their lights on, and they themselves made beautifully detailed silhouettes against the shore lights, which were all blazing.
Nachts sind wir an die Küste herangegangen und als wir merkten, dass es überhaupt keine Abwehr gab, sind wir natürlich immer frecher geworden, sodass wir in der Nähe von Kap Hatteras wirklich die Autos auf der Küstenstraße fahren sahen und die Wälder gerochen haben. Und wir also praktisch quasi von der Küste aus Schiffe torpediert haben.
Cape Hatteras became known as Torpedo Alley. What should have been a Station X success had turned into a fiasco.
We heard a tremendous explosion which shook the house and rattled the windows, and looked out and saw the ship burning. A red glow on that was the city of Atlanta, knowing to the book. And it didn't burn long because it sunk quick, and there's a lot of lives lost on the city of Atlanta. And I think the next night another one was sunk by the same Captain Hardingen.
The American Navy had the means to attack the U-boats, but chose not to. Guarding supplies for Britain was not seen as vital to the war effort. Instead, the destroyers were only sent to protect troop ships.
Thousands and thousands of people saw the wreckage that piled up along American shores, the oil, the wood, the coal dust, all the debris of sunken ships, occasional bodies of seamen. And occasionally, it must be said, the U.S. Navy dissembled, told false stories in an attempt to persuade the American people that it was destroying these U-boats, when in fact none had been destroyed.
The man responsible for the security of the East Coast was the Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, Admiral Ernest J. King. Eisenhower once confided to his diary that the best way to win the war was to shoot Admiral King.
King had some bad experiences during the First World War with Royal Navy officers, and apparently he made up his mind that he was not going to associate with them in any future war. And he spoke disparagingly of their ships, their crews, their intelligence, everything about the Royal Navy. He was an Anglophobe, pure and simple, and that was too bad for the special relationship that needed to be built between Great Britain and the United States for the successful prosecution of the Atlantic War.
The success of Operation Drumbeat was given massive publicity by the Third Reich. The homecoming submariners were national heroes.
Das habe ich sehr gut in Erinnerung, dass das mir damals auch schon peinlich war. Es war während der ganzen ersten Unternehmung eigentlich keine erkennbare Gefahr für uns aufgetreten. Und nun, da wir das erste Boot waren, welches von einem Einsatz an der US-Küste zurückkam, wurde das propagandistisch natürlich ganz hoch aufgehängt.
The Germans received medals, and Station X learned a hard lesson. Intelligence was only as good as the use that was made of it.
By the end of 6 months, a total of 397 ships had been sunk. It was, for Germany, the greatest single sustained U-boat campaign of the war. For the United States, it was the costliest naval defeat of the war.
After Operation Drumbeat, Station X's credibility was never questioned in America again. Churchill called Bletchley Park his goose that laid the golden eggs and never cackled. But Station X was stretched to its limits. Turing felt they could turn the tide of war, but they needed more support and more people, and they needed them now. Ignoring protocol, Turing went over everyone's head to the Prime Minister himself. Churchill's response was unequivocal. Action, this day. Station X was now firmly established on both sides of the Atlantic. What had started as a small band pitted against the Enigma was becoming a national code-breaking factory.
At the end of a period of horror and disaster, we should stand erect, masters of our fate, and with the conviction of final victory, burning unquenchable in our hearts.